Hey everyone. Last week we talked about potential rent versus market rent, and we're working our way down the financial statements. So this week we're going to quickly touch on vacancy. This is a factor that you see in all of your P&Ls, hopefully, and you're almost always going to see it somewhere in that 5 to 7% range, and it's going to be perfectly fine. Where your issues are going to come up is if you find a situation where there's an outlier. Either someone's assuming it to be way lower or way higher, or it should be way lower or way higher, and you're noticing that through the rest of your diligence. What people need to understand is vacancy isn't just the empty units in a property, and that's what in some cases someone tries to present to you. What vacancy really means, and what it should be labeled as, is the percentage of the potential rent that you're not receiving as the owner. And from a lower standpoint, that becomes problematic when you underwrite a fully occupied property, because someone's going to say it's fully occupied, we have a wait list, you're never going to have vacancies. That's just not the case, because any day or week or month that any unit's empty is going to become a vacancy relative to lost revenue. For instance, if you have a 50 unit property and approximately half the units roll over each year, which is what the market average is. In fact, it's probably a little higher right now, closer to 52%. That means 25 units are going to roll over the course of any given year and turn over. Even if you can turn those over within 2 weeks, doing all of the repairs, finding new tenants, moving tenants in, and having them pay, you're going to still lose about 50 weeks of revenue, which is approximately 2% vacancy right there, even with a fully occupied property. So just be aware there's going to be some level of revenue that you lose, which is effectively the vacancy that you may not see in a pro forma if someone's underwriting a 0% vacancy factor solely because the property is currently fully occupied. If it takes 4 weeks and takes a month to turn over, which isn't unreasonable, you're up to 4%. Now you're starting to get to that 5 to 7% range. So just be wary when someone tries to put zero vacancy in. It's never, ever going to happen. You're not buying a 100% triple net Starbucks retail center. You're buying a multifamily property, and people move. They buy houses, they move to different properties, whether they're looking for bigger or smaller units. It's just going to happen, so be aware of it. On the other end of the extreme is when there's a huge vacancy at a property and someone tries to underwrite back to that 5 to 7% because that's what a bank's going to underwrite to. Now, that's not necessarily unreasonable relative to where you would underwrite a stabilized value, but realize there's a real cost to getting to that stabilization. A client of mine is looking at a property in Southwest Florida right now, and it's a 22 unit property and only 2 units are currently occupied. And they're trying to underwrite with a 5% vacancy and value it that way. That's great, the market supports it, but someone has to lease up those remaining units to get it to 5%. And if you hire a property management company, they're most likely going to charge you upwards of 1 month of rent to lease those units. That 1 month of rent for the rest of those units is effectively 8% vacancy right there of revenue you're going to lose to lease up those properties. That doesn't include the cost to turn over those units and do the repairs on those units. So just be aware that even if you're going to underwrite a property that has a high vacancy today, whether it be because it's a new property in lease up or it's a property that was taken offline to do renovations, you're going to have to spend money to get it to stabilization. So you can underwrite it to a stabilized value, but be sure to net out your costs to lease up and turn over those units before you put your final valuation on that property. The other thing I want to talk about is, as I stated, vacancy really is the lost potential rent, not the number of vacant units in a property. And there are other scenarios, other reasons why you can lose revenue on a property. One of which is concessions. When it starts getting to an overheated market, when supply starts exceeding demand, you're going to start seeing properties give 1 month free rent, sometimes 2 months free rent. If you're giving 1 month free rent, you're effectively creating an 8% vacancy strictly by handing off that rent. If you're typically charging $1,000 a month in rent, that's lowering your effective rent to $917, and that's going to be passed on to the buyer, which is you, and you need to be aware of that. Now, this could be a known underwriting issue, and you can account for that, but just be aware, if it's a trend, you're getting $917 in the long term, and you better be underwriting $917. If they're providing these concessions for the sole purpose of increasing occupancy for sale, or if they're putting out $1,000 rents knowing that they're getting $915 and asking you to underwrite $1,000 going forward, be aware that these may not be actual numbers, and you need to be able to step those back to what the real vacancy would be and what the real rents will be. The other scenario in which you may lose revenue is bad debt expense. Even the best property in town, even the most Class A brand new property is going to have someone who doesn't pay their rent, and there's going to be some level of bad debt expense. Now, it's perfectly typical. Typically, it's so nominal that you'd almost not even consider it. Maybe you'll throw in 0.5% or 1% in there as bad debt just to cover your ass, but it's a real number. And where it becomes an issue is if it becomes a trend. If you start to see a trend of non-payments, if you ask for more than just the current rent roll, if you actually ask for 12 months, 24 months, 36 months of payment history, and you see a lot of people not paying, that could be a systematic problem with the property you're looking at. That could be a current owner that didn't do proper background checks, which doesn't just mean they didn't do proper background checks with the tenants that didn't pay, but it could mean not proper background checks on all of the tenants you're going to inherit. And you need to deal with those tenants going forward. And that could cause more than just a loss of revenue. That can cause a huge increase in expenses relative to legal expenses for evictions, or higher turnover rates, or higher repair rates. There are a number of issues with not having proper background checks on those tenants, which you may not have if you're starting to see way too much non-payment at the property. So just be wary when you're looking at it. Like I said from the start, vacancy factor is not typically a big deal. It's usually going to be 5 to 7%. 95 to 97% of the time, it's going to be perfectly fine. But please, just keep an eye out for the outliers. Make sure you do a cursory review and make sure you're not falling too far on one side or the other of this, and you'll be well protected and you'll be covering your ass. Keep an eye out for the blog on Friday relative to vacancy. I'll have more information on this. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.